UFC 302 betting and DraftKings show. We have 12 fights this weekend. I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. And we're going to kick things off in the flyweight division as Andre Lima comes in as a minus 245 favorite. The comeback on Mitch Raposo is plus 200. Now, Mitch Raposo is taking this fight on extremely short notice. He previously fought on The Ultimate Fighter and comes from a high school state champion wrestling background. And that's his path to victory here because we know that Lima is susceptible to giving up the takedowns. We saw that in his last fight against Severino, the infamous, where he got bit in the arm and he ended up winning via disqualification by Severino. But prior to that, it seemed like Severino was starting to really take over in that fight. And we saw him land multiple takedowns against Lima. Now, this is a spot where I would expect Lima to have much more firepower on the feet. I expect Lima to be the better submission grappler as well. But Raposo might be able to land a few takedowns here, which means he's not completely dead. My issue with Raposo is that he just doesn't have much skills once he gets you to the ground outside of just controlling you. He's not really looking to do a ton of damage. And like I mentioned, I think Lima's actually the better grappler and has the potential to submit Raposo on the mat if it gets there. And then on the feet, I think it's pretty much all Lima once he starts letting his hands go, those powerful leg kicks as well. So I'm going to side with Lima here. We'll say Lima by decision, but I think there's better fights to target on DraftKings. Next fight up, we have Ailin Perez, a minus 185 favorite. The comeback on Joselyne Edwards is plus 154. And we'll start on the Perez side. She's currently on a 2-fight win streak, and we know what she brings to the table. She has to get her grappling game going. And we saw in her last fight that even when she's able to get her grappling going sometimes, she's still very sloppy. On the feet, she basically doesn't have much to be concerned about, but even in the grappling, she gets sloppy at times. We saw the cardio be very suspect in the past, as well as in her recent fight against Kopylov. So that's the concern here, because Joselyne Edwards is coming off a very similar fight where Cornoli was just trying to take her down and ended up getting super gassed out, and that's where Edwards was able to defend those takedowns and take over. Now, I'd be a little bit more surprised if Edwards is able to do that here, just because I think Perez is a better grappler. I expect the takedowns to be there, and unless Perez is gassing out here, I just don't think Edwards is going to be able to defend those takedowns. We know she's given up position. She spends time on her back. And I think Perez can at least bank the first 2 rounds here before any type of cardio collapse. So give me Perez by decision. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Bassil Hafez, a minus 365 favorite. The comeback on Gall is plus 280. And we've seen some heavy line movement in favor of Hafez this week. And I'm not surprised because he's coming off his UFC debut last year against Jack Della Maddalena, where a lot of people thought you could make an argument that he won that fight. It was a very competitive fight. He landed takedowns, controlled Jack Della for nearly half that fight. And I expect that to be the game plan here because he's primarily a grappler. He's got some power on the feet, but it's definitely the grappling that he's looking to do. He's got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's facing Gall, a guy that I've never been very high on. I have questions about his durability, questions about his cardio. He fought to the end of his contract previously with the UFC and was not re-signed right away. They're bringing him back here in front of New Jersey, home crowd guy on somewhat short notice. So it's not like Gall is dead in this type of matchup by any stretch, but I do think his win condition is pretty limited because I expect there to be a decent amount of grappling in this fight, and I just think Hafez is the better grappler. And the last thing that I'll say is these two actually faced off in a grappling match. Granted, it was like 8 or 9 years ago, something like that, but Hafez did get the better of that, and I expect him to get the better of this one on Saturday as well. We're going Hafez by decision. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Alex Morono, a minus 245 favorite. The comeback on Niko Price is plus 200. Now, these guys fought, it seems like forever ago. It was early in both of their UFC careers. Now, Niko Price ended up coming back with a come-from-behind knockout victory of Alex Morono, and it was actually a brutal knockout. It ended up being overturned to a no contest because of a failed drug test by Niko Price, which is nothing new for the Niko Price career. Now, in terms of this matchup, I think a lot of the way they match up is very similar. I would expect Morono to be the better round winner, to be the better minute winner in this fight, just like he was in the first fight, in my opinion. I just think he's going to be much more active. I trust the jab, the calf kicks as well. And I think Morono's the guy that's always kind of had a little bit of underrated power. He is able to hurt some guys. He just has durability issues himself. He's been knocked out multiple times in his career. Now, fortunately for him, Niko Price has even worse durability issues. Niko Price has been knocked out 5 times in his career. Of course, he's coming off that Robbie Lawler knockout. Yes, 41-year-old Robbie Lawler with the knockout uppercut in the clinch against Niko Price the last time out. So this is one where I think both guys are flimsy. You can't trust either of them. But I just trust Morono a little bit more, and I think he gets it done. We're going Morono by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Jake Matthews, a -162 favorite. The comeback on Phil Rowe is +136, and we'll start on the Matthews side. He's coming off a decision loss to Michael Morales, looking to get back in the win column here, and I think this is a decent spot for him against Phil Rowe, who I've never been really that high on. Rowe's a very lanky guy for the division, very long, but he doesn't really use his tools that great. You know, he's primarily a striker, does have a little bit of grappling, but he showed he can give up the takedowns and can give up the control time. Now, he'll be working with a 7-inch reach advantage in this matchup, but I don't expect him to be able to keep that distance against Jake Matthews, who we know the striking has been improving over the course of his career, but I also just think he's the better grappler in this matchup. And lastly, the durability of Phil Rowe is a legitimate concern. I know Matthews has been hurt and finished in the past as well, but Phil Rowe has been hurt in just about all of his fights, even dating back to the Contender Series fight where he got hurt in that fight. In his last fight against Niko Price, a guy who has no durability, basically came back after losing the first 2 rounds and hurt Phil Rowe very bad, almost finished him in the third. And then, of course, Phil Rowe had an exciting comeback. So it's like this guy, I just think he's also got a couple softball matchups as well. Jason Witt in there. I just think he's a guy who has kind of outperformed relative to what I think his skill set is. And Matthews is just a little bit more proven at this stage. So I'm going to side with Jake Matthews here. Matthews by decision. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have Grant Dawson, a -355 favorite. The comeback on Solecki is +280. And the obvious expectation here is that Grant Dawson is going to land multiple takedowns. They should come fairly easily. We know Solecki is a guy that's willing to accept takedowns, fight off his back. He wants to be grappling, even if that means from the bottom position, because that's really his style. You know, he's a guard player, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, slick grappling, but that's his path to victory here, is he needs to catch Dawson in some sort of submission here. Otherwise, I think he's drawing pretty thin, because outside of the grappling, he really doesn't have much. On the feet, I think he's got some solid leg kicks, but he's not really known for his power. And that's really the type of fighter that can punish a guy like Grant Dawson, a guy who has no striking defense, who gets hit a ton in the face, doesn't defend strikes well whatsoever. We saw that in his last fight against Bobby Green, where he paid the ultimate price and got knocked out in the first round. But he's a relentless wrestler. He can land multiple takedowns here. He can do it at a high rate for 15 minutes if needed. The issue is I just don't trust a guy like Dawson, who we know has repeatedly put himself in bad spots in grappling exchanges. I talked about the striking defense as well. This is a guy who put himself in a deep choke against Derek Minner. He had a closer fight than you would expect against the corpse of Leonardo Santos as well. There's been multiple fights in his career where you just don't feel good about laying big juice on this guy. So I'm going to stay away from a betting perspective, because I think Solecki catching him in some type of sub, or maybe even potentially hurting him with a fluky punch, is not the craziest thing. So for that reason, I'm going to have exposure to both sides on DraftKings, but I'm still going to pick Dawson to win, because I think a Dawson decision is the most likely outcome. Which brings us to our next fight in the middleweight division, as we have Roman Kopylov, who is now a slight underdog, as Cesar Almeida has flipped to a favorite during the week. He's now currently a -118 favorite. The comeback on Kopylov is -102. And this is an interesting matchup, because I think we have two kickboxers that want to keep the fight on the feet. Both guys have clear issues with the defensive grappling. For starters, the Kopylov side, 11 of his 12 wins have come by knockout. We know what he brings to the table. He's very powerful on the feet, particularly with that head kick and the body kick as well. And he usually takes a little bit of time to get his reads before he ends up getting his opponents out of there. A lot of his finishes came in the second and third round historically. And then on the flip side, Almeida previously fought on Contender Series. We know the story with him. He was a big dog on Contender Series. He comes from a high-level kickboxing boxing background. He gets it done against Dylan Butka his last time out as an underdog again. Now, I just think this is a much tougher test for him because I mentioned both guys struggle with the defensive grappling, but I also think Almeida is just a little bit worse in terms of I just feel like people are overvaluing him now because of the win over Butka, where it's he was basically just neutralized for 5 or 6 minutes, held up against the fence, did absolutely nothing. And yes, he was able to defend takedowns and make sure that Butka didn't do anything either. So it was a really boring fight until Butka completely gassed out and then Almeida got him out of there. I just don't see this fight. Really, I just don't think you could take away anything from that fight to what's going to happen against Roman Kopylov, who's a very good kickboxer in his own right. I mentioned the leg kicks as well. I think either of these guys have the potential to hurt each other. It's a very close fight. I'm not confident one way or the other. I just think the field and the market is going to be overconfident in the Almeida side. So that's the point that I'm trying to articulate. I'm going to slightly side with Kopylov just because I feel like he's a little bit more proven at this stage in his career. We're going Kopylov by decision. That's the official pick. Next up, we got Randy Brown, a -175 favorite. The comeback on Eliza Zaleski dos Santos is +145. And you guys know me, I'm not a big Randy Brown guy historically. I actually bet against him in that Solecki fight where he ended up getting the finish there. So he has burned me in the past, but I think this is a decent spot for him here against dos Santos, even though I think historically Brown kind of fights on thin margins. And I've said that multiple times about him because he's long, he's rangy, solid striker, but he's a little bit flimsy at times as well. And even though his grappling is decent, his defensive wrestling is not great either. And I don't fully trust his durability. So he's not really a guy that I ever want to be laying big chalk on. And yes, he was able to cover in that last fight against Solecki because he got the finish. But I think going 15 minutes, like a lot of his fights do, I think you have to project him to be pretty competitive with a lot of these guys, regardless of whether he's the favorite or the underdog. And I think that's what we have here is another competitive fight. Zaleski dos Santos, another proven veteran, has power. Most of his wins have come inside the distance. But I worry about dos Santos in the sense that the volume, I think, has clearly dropped off. Previously, he was known as a high volume guy. It just really hasn't materialized over his last few fights. And I think the durability is clearly on the downside as well. So it's he's getting older, don't really trust the durability. And if I can't bank on the volume either, I expect him to be competitive, but it's just not going to be enough for me to pick him in this matchup. So I'm going to go with Randy Brown by split decision. That's the official pick. And next up, we have Jailton Almeida, a -270 favorite. The comeback on Alexandr Romanov is +220. And I really like the Almeida side in this matchup. I actually think this price could be value both on DraftKings and in the betting line because I think a lot of people are just expecting Romanov, much bigger guy, wrestling background, he's going to be able to land takedowns here. And I just personally don't see it. I think a lot of people are judging Almeida too harshly based on that Curtis Blaydes loss his last time out. And listen, Curtis Blaydes is one of the best fighters in the division. Curtis Blaydes, very good wrestler, very good striker, just doesn't really have the durability. Now, Almeida was trying to chain wrestle him, gassed out, got tired, and just got finished. That's going to happen when you're facing the best of the best. Alexandr Romanov is certainly not the best of the best, in my opinion. This guy has had a couple softball matchups early in his UFC career. They were pumping him up like he was the next big thing in the division. And then look what happened. He started facing guys that weren't the bottom barrel guys, the Jared Vanderas, the Marcos Rogerio de Lima, who's known to be a little flimsy at times and get himself finished. Guys like that, where he was able to land a takedown instantly and just King Kong ground and pound them to a finish or find a submission. And what happens when he can't do that? Well, we saw in the Marcin Tybura fight, he looked very beatable in that fight, ended up losing a very close decision. Followed that up against Alexander Volkov, stuffed all of his takedowns. The guy was gassed within 2 minutes and then got himself finished, completely embarrassed, didn't even land a single strike in that fight. So since then, what does he do? He comes back and beats the corpse of Blagoy Ivanov in not even a convincing fashion, landed a couple takedowns, won an uninspiring decision. So I just don't think that Romanov here is going to be able to land takedowns. I actually think Almeida is going to be the one to land takedowns. He averages just under 7 takedowns per 15 minutes. And the only person that's actually shot takedowns on Romanov was Juan Espino, who landed 4 of 5 takedowns. Now we know Espino is a high-level wrestler, a good grappler as well. Guess what? So's Almeida, and he's a physical freak. And I know people are going to talk about the size difference because Romanov is huge. Guess what? Almeida's fought guys that are just as huge. Derek Lewis, who he ragdolled for 25 minutes. Yes, 25 minutes. Landed 6 takedowns, controlled him for almost every second of that fight. Romanov has no shot here. He's going to be on his back pretty much instantly. I think Almeida dominates him, and I think he proves everyone that's kind of jumped off the bandwagon wrong this weekend, and he gets it done with an early finish. We're going Almeida by TKO. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our next matchup in the middleweight division, as Kevin Holland is a minus 248 favorite with Michal on the comeback at plus 210. We'll start on the Holland side. He's moving back up to 185 in this fight, and I would expect him to have a clear speed advantage in this fight. This is a spot where I think he's going to have multiple advantages in terms of the intangibles, the speed, the durability, which I think is a clear advantage in this matchup. And I also just think he's the better overall striker, not the better pure boxer, because that's what Alexandr is very good at, moving forward, landing punches in combination up and close in the phone booth. But outside of that, outside of his boxing technique and that power, he just doesn't have enough. And in terms of the durability, I think it's a clear advantage for Holland. In terms of the grappling, I think it's a clear advantage for Holland. The only thing is we can't fully trust Holland to use that big grappling edge because his fight IQ is just simply not there at times. Now, even if he doesn't choose to use that grappling advantage, I still think he can win this fight on those intangibles alone, and I expect that to be the case here. This is the first bet I made this week. I played the over 1.5 rounds at minus 130. I just think Holland's super durable. Alexandr has to win by knockout, and I just don't see that happening here. Now, on the flip side, Holland could certainly find a finish himself, but I think it more than likely would come in the later half of the fight unless he chooses to proactively grapple from the jump, which, like I said, I just don't expect him to do that. So I think this fight goes over 1.5, and I actually wouldn't be surprised to see it cruise to 15 minutes with Holland decisively getting his hand raised. We're going Holland by decision. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our co-main event, as Sean Strickland is a minus 238 favorite with Paulo Costa on the comeback at plus 195. And one quick note here before we talk about the matchup, this is a 5-round fight for DraftKings purposes. Even though they're not fighting for a belt, it is going to be a 5-rounder, so keep that in mind. We have the additional 2 rounds if the fight were to get extended. And I actually think it does here because Sean Strickland, we know, kind of turns a lot of his fights into kind of a boring style sparring match. And even that last title defense against Dricus du Plessis that he ended up losing a split decision, it was really because he was just a little bit too lackadaisical at times, where it's like if he was just a little bit more aggressive with the volume and putting his foot on the gas pedal at times, it would have made a difference in my opinion, but it just wasn't there. And I think that's just his style, is he tries to kind of lull his opponents to sleep to a degree with his jab, his calf kicks, very nonchalant in there, just kind of wants to have a sparring match. And on the flip side, Paulo Costa, this is a really quick turnaround for him because historically, he does not fight very often. We know he's lost 4 of his last 5 fights. Yes, they've come against the better fighters in the division, but I just don't know if I can get there with Paulo Costa. I know the number's tempting here. He's going to have the power advantage, but 2 things I worry about. One, historically in the past, he had really high output, and it just really hasn't been there over his last couple fights. And I don't really think it's going to be there against Sean Strickland, who has, kind of that shell defense. I'd expect him to limit a lot of the big shots coming back. And I just think the jab, the volume over 25 minutes, the cardio is all going to favor Strickland, especially as the fight goes on, which I expect it to go on. So I'm going to side with Strickland here. I think he gets his hand raised, and I think it comes by decision. We're going Sean Strickland by decision. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our main event, as Islam Makhachev comes in as a minus 575 favorite. The comeback on Dustin Poirier is plus 425. And I don't have a hot take for this one, guys. I'm going to side with Makhachev just because I expect the takedowns and the grappling to be there. And I think that's how most people expect this fight to play out. Dustin only defends takedowns at 63%. Yes, he's got a really tight guillotine choke, and I think that's one of the ways he can win this fight is Islam gets sloppy on a takedown and Dustin snatches something up. I think that's possible. I also think it's possible that Dustin could catch him on the feet. We know Poirier is a dog. We never want to count him out. We just saw it last time against Benoit Saint-Denis. Granted, Saint Denis, much lower degree of a grappler and overall fighter than Islam Makhachev, but still, Poirier was an underdog there. A lot of people counted him out. I picked against him myself, and he ends up completely exposing Saint Denis and coming through. So I never want to count out Dustin. He's always got that dog in him, but I just think it's a tough matchup for him. I think it plays out pretty similarly to that Khabib fight did years back, because not much has changed with Dustin's game, and I think Islam is just as good in terms of the takedowns, the relentless style grappling. I think he just rinses and repeats until he eventually finds a finish himself. We're going Makhachev by submission. That's the official pick, and this is an obvious fight to target on DraftKings. As always, guys, fightnumbers.com will have my DraftKings player rankings. It'll have my ownership projections as well. It'll have a bunch of stuff on the betting side. We have the odds screen, which we just made a bunch of updates to that I'm super excited about. We added the GTD option as well as the previous options that we had on there for alternate totals, 1.5 and 2.5, along with the best prices option as well. Tons of stuff out there. Of course, we've got the picks behind the paywall, ton of other content as well, and tools that are coming down the pipeline. I really want you guys to check it out and let me know what you think. As always, I'll link it in the comments. Best of luck this week, guys, and we'll catch you next time.